Well, it was 4 a.m. in the morning and the old alarm clock jingled to life. And Roy crawled out of the bed, put on his clothes, shook himself awake, and went down to the kitchen. Went into the refrigerator, pulled out 3 biscuits from last night's supper, took his finger and poked a hole in each one of them, took a butter knife, put some butter down in there, and then poured blackstrap molasses in them. Grabbed a can of dog food for old Rex and went out in the backyard, cut him loose. And the 2 of them went walking on down Stansbury Road down to Bear Creek there in Dundalk. There's about a mile walk down there. And it was still dark, so there wasn't much going on, very little traffic. They kind of had the place to themselves. They got down there to Bear Creek to the schooner dock, which was all grown up in small trees and tall brush because it hadn't been used in a lot of years for hauling grain out of the Dundalk farm area there. Anyway, old Rex ate his breakfast, laid down, went to sleep, and Roy kind of laughed. Rex looked like roadkill laying there with his legs all spraddled out and both ears laying out flat on the ground like last winter's dead leaves or something. Roy cast his line overboard. He had a spreader on there and a couple of hooks with a minnow on each hook, and a red bobber on top floating around on the water, and it spread some little wavelets out around in a circle. The poles along the dock and the wood there all wiggled around inside those ringlets as they moved outward. Roy sat there and watched it for a few minutes, got tired of holding the pole, went back and leaned up against a tree along the edge there and sat down in the moss there and slowly dozed off. He shook his head and woke up and looked all around, and then he heard the frogs. The old daddy frog over there in the marsh right close by said, "Wade in, wade in, wade in." And the mama frog said, "Knee-deep, knee-deep, knee-deep." And the baby frog said, "Better turn around, better turn around, better turn around." Well, Roy had heard that Carolina low country tale about the frog singing from his granddaddy long time ago. But this was the first time he ever heard the song himself. And he leaned back against a tree with insects buzzing around his head. Looked up at the sun. The ring on the sun was chasing itself around and around and around the sun, and purple and red, and insects slowly moved away, and the ring went slower and slower and slower. Well, to Roy's surprise, he found himself walking down an alley, cobblestone alley with brick buildings on either side, shaded by the buildings, kind of dark in there. But he come out onto a wide street with the sun in the west, and walked down the street. There was no cars, no people, nothing. Looked like he had the whole place to himself. And the street made a turn, but he kept on going straight. It was a big open field there as far as he could see, and it had tall grass growing on it up chest high with grain tasseling off the top of it. So he kept on going. Then he walked and he walked. It seemed like he walked for days. As he looked back, he realized that they weren't buildings at all. They were tall cliffs. And those cliffs had paintings and etchings on them from thousands of years ago. They were covered in soot from campfires, and they were ancient. Well, he walked on, and off in the distance he could see a tree growing out of the grass. It was all surrounded by that tall grass, and it kind of made him feel a little bit comforted. So he headed forward as though it was a refuge, and finally, after a couple hours of walking, he arrived at it. And it was a willow tree. Well, he knew there had to be water nearby because willow trees require a lot of water. And sure enough, he walked under it. There was a stream running by, heading down to its briny mother, the Atlantic Ocean. And there was moss under the tree. Well, he knelt down beside the stream, cupped his hands together, filled them with water, and drank from the stream, cool and delicious. He laid back on a soft green moss that surrounded the tree in the shade. There was flickering of sunlight coming through the leaves of the tree, and it flickered across his eyes and he closed them. And they slowly but surely put him to sleep. And he laid there for a long time. And he woke to the sound of singing. And he sat up and looked around, and here come an Indian girl, dressed in Indian dress with moccasins, and she was singing. And suddenly she looked up and saw him. She says, "Oh my, are you Sky Rider?" He said, "Well, I don't think so." She said, "Yes, you are Sky Rider. I have prayed for you for many, many winters. I have been alone all this time. I have lived here in the woods, and I've been alone. And I have prayed for someone. I dreamed one night that a beaver would swim across the sky and facing the sun, and on top of him would be a rider. And I called him Sky Rider. And that's who you are. You are Sky Rider. You have come to be with me." And he said, "No, I don't think so." He said, "That's not my name." She said, "Oh, I have given you that name. And you shall forever be Sky Rider." Well, he was a bit confused. She says, "Come with me. We will go to my wiki hut, and we will eat, and we will talk." So he followed her, and a little bit she tripped and fell, and he reached down and grabbed her up, asked her if she was all right, and she said yes, and she was happy because he was strong. She told him, "The wolves will come one day, and you and I will back to back stand them off. They won't attack if someone's facing them. You'll have my back and I'll have your back. And we will live here in the forest together and peace, and we will have a good life together. And there will be babies." And he said, well, he didn't know so much about that, but anyway, he went with her. They stayed together in her wiki up. They spent a long time when the north wind blew and the snow fell, and it was cold, but they had a fire and they were warm and they enjoyed each other's company, and they bedded down at night, and life was good. Well, finally the wind come up out of the south bringing warmth, and the wolf pups were out of the den, and they decided to go for a swim. So they walked down to the water's edge and took off their clothes, and they went swimming. Well, far off in the distance, they could see a big canoe with white clouds on top of it, driven by the wind. And it come closer and closer, and they stood on the beach and watched. And after a time, it came in close to them, and it stopped there. It dropped an anchor, and it stopped. A man got off in a small canoe, and he rowed it ashore. And Skyrider told the Indian girl, you have named me, and I need to give you a name because I have to call you something. And he said, I will call you Aletha. And she said, okay. She was happy with that. She liked that name. It sounded good to her. So anyway, so the guy come toward them in the boat. Well, Aletha ran out in the water, and she still had her fishing spear in her hand and frightened him. And he had a stick with a hole in the end of it. And it made a loud sound. And it spoke to Aletha, and fire came out the end and touched her breast, and she fell into the water. Skyrider ran, grabbed her up out of the water, and she breathed her last couple of breaths, and she passed away. Well, Skyrider was angry. He ran out into the water, threw the man into the water, held him underwater until he was dead, and then he pushed him out to sea. He went back, got Aletha, and carried her home breathing hard. He took her up into a tree, and he laid her out on branches up there where the animals couldn't get to her, and covered her up in her blanket, all dressed in her finest dress, finest clothes. Skyrider took the necklace off from around his neck, pulled it up over his head, the beaded one with the conch and the tree on it, and he put it around Aletha's neck, covered her with a blanket, and made his way down out of the tree. Everything had changed for him, and he was sad. And he stayed there all through the fall when the leaves were falling, and through the winter when the cold winds blew again and the snow fell. In the spring, he left, walking back in the direction he had come from. And he passed the tree and stepped back, went back to it, and lay down, went to sleep. And suddenly, he found himself on a street. He walked down the street, buildings all around, and there was a little restaurant with tables and chairs sitting out in front of it under an awning. And somebody called to him, Skyrider, Skyrider. He looked around, and there sat a raven-haired girl sitting at a table, and she was waving to him. She looked familiar, but he couldn't figure out who she was. Roy stood there on the sidewalk, not knowing quite what to do. The lady waved towards him and said, come sit down. And she patted a seat beside her. She said, I want to talk to you. You and I have a story to talk about. And so he finally moseyed on over towards her and sat down. Well, she reached into the pocket of the white dress she had on, and she pulled out a necklace of beads with a conch in the middle, an engraving of a tree and tall grass, moss, and a stream running underneath. She leaned forward and put it around his neck. He started to take it off. She said, no, don't take it off. Keep it on. She said, someday it will mean something to you. Keep it. Well, Roy was really confused. He didn't know what the heck this was all about. Roy awoke to the cane pole rattling up against the pollen, and old Rex barking and carrying on and whining. Roy finally gathered himself together, got up, took hold of the pole, and wrestled with a great big old fish on the other end of that line. And the pole was bending. He thought it was going to break, and finally, though slowly, but the fish began to tire, and he got him up close reached down in his mouth, stuck his finger through the fish's gill, and pulled him out of the water. And he was looking at about 30 pounds of rockfish. Quite a big catch. Well, Roy scaled him, gutted him, cleaned him, tied a line up through his gill, and put him over his shoulder on a line. And him and old Rex walked home. Rex kept sniffing at him as though he didn't hardly recognize him. But anyway, they went on home. That night, Roy was laying in bed and thinking about this thing that had happened to him. Was it a dream? He didn't know. What about the conch? He reached down and touched the necklace. The necklace was real. It was a mystery. It was a real mystery. He had no idea. He couldn't understand it. Finally, he dropped off to sleep, and he remembered it. And for many years, he thought about it off and on. But he never met the lady with the raven hair. Well, Roy lived to be a very old man. He had several children. His wife had passed away. Roy was over 100. And he passed away. They had a funeral at the local funeral parlor. And his daughters were now getting a little up in age themselves. Well, they were all, the casket was sitting there, and Roy was on display. And a lady in a white dress walked in. She had black hair, dark eyes, very pretty. Young, maybe 18 years old, 20. She walked up and she put a necklace around his neck of beads. The daughter walked up and said, "Who are you?" She said, "I don't believe I know you." And the lady says, "Well, I knew your father many, many years ago before he ever met your mother. Him and I were teenagers together. But someday you will understand. This doesn't make any sense to you, I know, but someday you will understand. There will come a time when you will know." The daughter reached down, started to take the necklace off, and the lady says, "No, don't take that off. It will mean something to him. It may not mean anything to you, but it is of importance to him." And she turned slowly, kissed him on the cheek, and walked down the aisle to nobody ever saw her again. The family talked about it often and wondered about it, but nobody really understood what it was all about. So I guess that's really, that kind of lines this story up. I mean, you can't go much farther than somebody in a coffin. So anyhow, I hope you all enjoyed this. I actually dreamed this. And of course I've had to add to it a little bit to have it make sense, because dreams don't usually make a lot of sense. And it's been a pleasant memory for me, and I hope y'all enjoyed it. Bye bye.